Hi everyone, Grant K here for the Flame Premium Learning channel. In the previous video, we concluded looking at the batch-centric workflow by discussing iterations in batch. In this video, we'll take what we know up to this point and focus on the timeline-centric workflow available in Flame Premium. As before in previous versions of the Flame products, the timeline-centric workflow revolves around the concept of keeping all your work in the sequence using BatchFX. Now, with all the changes in Flame Premium 2016, let's take a look at the available workflow. You can use your own sequences to follow along. So to establish the scenario, there is an open sequence clip loaded in a reel in the Reels group. For the moment, the batch group is collapsed, as we'll keep everything in the sequence. To apply any timeline effects to a segment, select the segment and press Ctrl-Tab for the effects ribbon. Now there are a few options, but for now, just click Create BatchFX. Now let's take a look at the media panel. Firstly, the BatchFX name is linked to the BFX output node as well as the BFX segments name by default. Changing either the BFX output node or the BFX segments name will change the BatchFX name. So if you exit out of BatchFX, you will see the name change in the selected BFX segment. However, going back into the BatchFX and manually changing the BatchFX name will break the link to the BFX output node and BFX segment name. Any iteration created with the different BatchFX name will not correspond to the BFX output node or BFX segments name. If you want to re-establish the link between BatchFX, BFX output node and the segment name, just rename the BatchFX to the same name as the BFX output. The second point to look at is that the BatchFX starts with one schematic reel for all the sources brought into BatchFX. You can call up the contextual menu and add as many schematic reels as you like to organize your media. However, you are unable to view the schematic reels as clips on a reel view since this is not available through BatchFX. You use the media panel to view your clips. You will also notice that batch shelf reels are omitted from the media panel. This is because everything ultimately renders through the BFX output node back to the sequence. However, as an exception, you can use render nodes to render to a Reels group or libraries. But this means the rendered media has no association to the BatchFX setup or sequence. You can also use write nodes to export media out of Flame, but then it's out of the Flame ecosystem. We'll take a look at how to use render and write nodes at the end of this video. Focusing back on the timeline-centric workflow, all the creative tools should function like the batch creative area. Go ahead and start building your batch flow graph. Now you have come to a similar point to the batch-centric workflow where you want to iterate your work as it develops. To iterate the current BFX flow graph, click the Iterate button. Now, iterations created in the timeline-centric workflow differ to the batch-centric workflow. When you create an iteration using BatchFX for the first time in the project, a new library is created called BatchFX Iterations. In previous versions of Flame Premium, the snapshots were created in the Snapshots folder on the desktop. This created a number of consequences. Firstly, the snapshot had no relevance to the sequence. Secondly, the current batch setup in the desktop would get filled up with BFX snapshots that were not related to it. Finally, the active desktop was constantly dealing with work in progress. BatchFX iterations could easily get lost as the desktop evolved through the project. So in Flame Premium 2016, iterations from BatchFX are created in a specific library. A new batch group is created with the current BatchFX name. When you expand the batch group, you will see the current BatchFX setup, schematic reels, and an empty shelf reel. If you do not see the iterations folder, call up the contextual menu on the desktop entry and show batch iterations. So to remind you, all iterations created in BatchFX get saved to the batch iterations library, and are not actually part of the sequence. It is intentional to keep the iterations separate from the BatchFX in the sequence. This ensures that the sequence won't become bloated with multiple iterations in every BFX segment. If you want to keep your iterations, you need to remember to wire or archive them with the related sequence. Now, looking at the BFX components using the All tab, everything in the workspace is exposed. You have the current BatchFX component at the top. Next, you have the desktop component containing the current batch group and Reels group. And finally, you have the library component that contains the BatchFX iterations library. Now, every BatchFX connects to its iterations through a naming association. As long as the BatchFX retains the same name as the iterations will appear in the pull-down menu next to the Iterations button. Understandably, the amount of data in the media panel might be overwhelming when just working in BatchFX. However, if you switch to the BFX Filter tab, only the elements concerning the current BatchFX is shown. You get the Schematic Reels for the flow graph, but you will also get all the available iterations. Within the BFX filter, the Iterations folder is able to reveal all the connected iterations linking back to the BatchFX iterations library. This works as long as the BatchFX matches the name of the iterations. Add another node into the flow graph and press Iterate. You have the same options to replace or increment the iteration. Create another iteration and add a few more nodes before iterating again. When it comes to loading iterations in BatchFX, you can choose from the pull-down menu or drag from the Iterations folder in the Media panel. However, since the BFX output node cannot be deleted or replaced, the iterations can only be appended to the flow graph. This matches the BatchFX behavior in previous versions of the Flame products. From this point, you can do everything in BatchFX compared to previous versions, including the recursive BatchFX workflow. As before, you could render the BFX output node in BatchFX or when looking at the sequence. Everything is kept inside the BFX segment within the sequence. Now let's come back to the render and write node I spoke of earlier. If you want to render an intermediate or final result out from the sequence, just add the appropriate nodes into the flow graph. The render and write nodes will both display the render range of the frames that are to be processed. Double-clicking on the render node, you can set the render destination for the media. This could be the current Reels group or a new one. Or you could render straight back to the libraries. As for the write node, you could define an export path. All rendering options support the naming tokens in order to match your production pipeline. But one big important point to remember for both of these nodes is that you need to click the Render Range button in each node to process the result. The main render button will only process the BFX output node. It's a small but handy piece of information. Finally, it is very important to remember that the setups in Batch and BatchFX are completely interchangeable. If you exit BatchFX and switch to the Batch Creative Area, you can drag in a BFX setup or iteration. They can either be appended to the existing batch group or replace the existing flow graph. And not to forget, you can also bring in a BFX clip and expand it into Batch as an alternative workflow. The same can go in reverse. You can drag a batch group into an active BatchFX and it will be appended to the current BFX flow graph. So the workflow is bidirectional. You start in a batch-centric workflow and move over to a timeline-centric workflow or vice versa. You have full control of how you manage your production in Flame Premium. Now up to this point, you have only ever seen a desktop with one batch group and one Reels group. In the next video, we'll take a look at how you can manage multiple batch groups in a single desktop. Comments, feedback, and suggestions are always welcome and appreciated. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to the Flame Premium Learning channel for future videos.